Hi everyone, in the next 30 minutes I'm going to present to you 10 opening systems or setups that you can play as white against almost anything that black plays. Let's take a look. So let's face it, you've memorized opening principles, and as a chess player you begin to realize, oh my gosh, there are so many openings to play and remember over the board. Now, for those of us who work full time, it can be quite daunting to invest so much of our time into learning an opening. However, there is an effective shortcut. Instead of investing so much time into memorizing, let's say, the first 20 moves of the Najdorf Sicilian, you can instead play an opening system that will get you an okay position out of the opening, gives you some easy middle game plans, and once learned, will allow you to focus on other aspects of chess, so doing tactics or endgames, for example. So a system opening is normally for the player who has the white pieces, and it's a series of beginning moves that lead to a certain opening formation. Quite often, white will play the same opening moves regardless of what black plays. Here we're more interested in playing a formation of moves and getting our pieces developed onto good squares. Now, there are a lot of advantages to playing an opening system. For one, it does save a lot of time on the clock. So quite often some of the strongest bullet or blitz players will adopt opening systems as a way of saving time on the clock, because they're just going to be playing out moves very quickly regardless of what black plays, and therefore not use too much time on the clock. Another great reason for playing an opening system is it allows us to reach positions that we are comfortable with. Because we're playing the same thing over and over again as white, we will end up becoming experts in that particular opening system or setup. Now, because we're playing the same opening over and over again, quite often the middle game plans remain the same because we're developing our pieces to the same squares. But probably the biggest reason why people play opening systems is it involves a lot less memorization of specific move orders. We're just memorizing the formation that we want and where we want our pieces to go to. So we don't need to worry about so much about all the different responses that black plays. We're just aiming for a formation. Now, there are some disadvantages with playing opening systems. One of the biggest reasons why people don't enjoy playing opening systems is they don't generally tend to be the most aggressive openings. Because we're trying to memorize a formation of pieces and we're playing the same thing against anything that our opponent plays, quite often a lot of opening systems will avoid any confrontation or any complications in the opening. And as a result, sometimes play in the opening can be quite stale or quite drawish if white allows it. And perhaps the biggest pitfall of playing an opening system is often players will stop thinking about the first few moves of their game. They'll get so used to not worrying about what black does that they don't think critically about the first few opening moves. So don't fall into the trap of just playing the same thing over and over again and not actually think about what black is doing as well on his side of the board. Despite all of this, opening systems are a great way of fulfilling good opening principles. They all control the center in some way, they all develop our pieces to good squares quickly and harmoniously, and quite often most opening systems will get our king to a safe square safely castle. So the first system we're going to be looking at is called the like system. In this system, it involves you clicking the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments below of any systems you like to play. Okay, so let's have a look at a number of different opening setups. So in alphabetical order, let's have a look at our first setup, the Barcza System. So this is a system which involves a very fast kingside fianchetto. So quite often we'll start the game with a move like knight to f3, and there we will follow it up with the move g2 to g3, bishop to g2, and finally a castle on the king's side. So here we have our bishop nicely fianchettoed on this long diagonal. We have our knight developed, but most importantly we have our king castled and safe from any dangers from the opening. Now, a great advantage of playing this particular opening setup is it gets our king castled and away from the centre as quickly as possible. Another reason to play this particular opening setup is it can lead to a number of different openings afterwards. After the move d4, we can sometimes get into various Catalan setups. Instead of this, we can also play c4, and now we've entered and transposed into some of the mainline English positions. Another thing that we can also do with this particular system is that we can play d3 and then we can play e4 afterwards and enter into a King's Indian attack. So this particular system can lead to a number of different other openings. But of course, a downside of playing this particular setup is that we do have to then memorize another opening after learning this system. So do be aware of that if you do decide to play this particular setup. Now, namely, our plan here in a lot of the different setups is to try and avoid this bishop from being captured. The reason why we don't want this bishop to be exchanged is it's a key defender of the white king, but also it controls this very long and powerful diagonal. Okay, so let's see an example of the Barcza system in practice where we enter into a King's Indian attack. So here we could start the game with knight to f3, and let's say black plays knight to f6. We now play pawn g2 to g3, getting ready to fianchetto our bishop onto g2. Then d5 is played, taking over some of the centre. We now put our bishop onto g2. e6 might be seen because black wants to maybe get his bishop onto one of the dark squares here to get ready to castle as well, and white just simply castles. So we've entered into our main Barcza system. We now have bishop to e7, and in this particular game we're going to focus on how white can get into his King's Indian attack setup. This is particularly effective when we see this pawn on e6. So here white could play pawn from d2 to d3. Black now castles. We put our knight onto d2, getting ready to push forward with the move e4. Black plays c5 to get some of the centre for himself, and now e4 and knight to c6. Black is momentarily stopping this push on e5 because he can retreat his knight back to then start attacking this pawn. We've reached a mainline position of the King's Indian attack, and there are a number of different ways that white can play here. Namely, one of the easiest ways to play is put your rook onto f1 to help support this e5 push. And sometimes what is often seen in the King's Indian attack is white will go for this long tour with his knight via f1 and moves like h4 to reroute this knight onto g4 in some lines. There's some lots of interesting resources on the King's Indian attack, and you can reach it out of the Barcza system. So the next opening setup we're going to be looking at is the Bird-Larsen Attack. Now this can be reached in a variety of different ways. Some people like to play b3 first, some people like to play f4 first. We're going to be focusing on what happens after the move f4 first. So here our setup is going to be as followed. We're going to play b3 followed by the move pawn to e3. Then we're going to get our bishop onto b2 along this long diagonal again, and notice how much control we already have on these dark squares. We're then going to put our knight onto f3, and depending on what black does here, we need to be quite flexible with where we put our bishop, because if we can get it onto b5 attacking this knight, this can be a really effective way of limiting the amount of control black has on these dark squares. The reason being, we can either exchange our bishop off against this knight, and then this knight no longer helps or controls these dark squares. So if that doesn't happen though, we put our bishop onto e2, and then we follow it up with castles on the king's side. Now from here we can do a number of different plans, but one of the most common plans here is to play our pawn up to d3 and follow up with our knight coming onto d2, and then we can start a kingside attack via queen to e1, then pushing it onto h4, then following it up with knight to e5 to help in the attack, and play moves like g4 and g5, and just going for a quick kingside attack. Okay, so let's see this particular setup in action. So after the moves f4, maybe black might play d5 to control the centre. We might want to play a number of different things. We could put our knight onto f3 first, or d3 first, e3 first. But here we're going to play pawn to b3, knight to f6, bishop to b2, and let's say e6 happens again. We can now play our pawn to e3. Maybe a move such as c5, black trying to take control of some of the central squares, knight to f3, and here this is where things get interesting, because if this knight comes to c6, we've got this nasty pin on this knight. Bear in mind, this knight is a key defender of these dark squares, so if we can get rid of this knight, this is a great way of helping us give more power to this bishop on this dark diagonal. If maybe black plays something like a6 here, we can exchange off quite happily, and then we can castle, and once again we can start our plan maybe of playing d3 followed by knight to b to d2, queen to e1, followed up with queen to h4, getting our knight into e5, and then playing our g4 g5 plan. Now, one thing just to be really careful of if you do decide to play this opening system, if you are playing f4, just be careful, because black does have a move here that is an interesting gambit with the move e5, which is known as the From's Gambit, and there are lots of traps associated with this particular move order. Now, the main line is absolutely fine for white. You just need to learn what to do here to get a nice effective setup. Or if you do want to and you wish to be quite brave over the board, you could surprise black with the move e4, and actually you've transposed into a king's gambit. So that could be quite a fun little surprise weapon to play against this particular gambit. Now, if you want an opening system that's really aggressive, you might want to consider this next opening setup known as the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit. Now, I've featured this quite a lot for my channel. I've actually even done a docu-series focusing on the creator, Diemer himself. Now, the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit, it starts with the moves d4, and depending on what black plays, if let's say he plays d5, which is quite common, we're now going to play the move e4, gambiting one of our central pawns. After the pawn captures, we play knight to c3, attacking this pawn, and after black defends with f6, here we can play the move f3, gambiting our second pawn. Play can continue with e takes on f3, and normally white will recapture with the knight on f3. Another interesting way is actually to recapture with the queen, which leads to a different opening gambit known as the Rider Gambit, which is still part of the Blackmar-Diemer system. But normally the white knight will recapture, and play will continue with white developing a lot of his pieces to really good squares, which have been allowed due to the fact that he's gambited a pawn. He's got much freer and much easier development than black. Now, going back for a second, you can also reach this out of an Indian game defense. So if black plays knight to f6, you can play maybe either knight to c3, and after d5 you can play the move e4, and here you can transpose back into a Blackmar-Diemer if they decide to take with the pawn and you play f3. Or if they don't do this and they take with the knight instead, you enter into a different gambit. After knight captures, pawn captures, you can play what's called the Hopsch Gambit as well, which is also part of the Blackmar-Diemer system. However, if you don't wish to play this Hopsch Gambit because you've exchanged off a set of minor pieces, another way to play is playing the move f3, which is known as the Pale Face Attack. Here, after d5, you can play e4, now attacking the centre. If they capture with the pawn, which they're going to do normally, you put your knight onto c3. You've now transposed back into the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit. So let's see the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit in action. If, let's say, the pawn captures on f3, knight takes on f3, and sometimes black will play the moves e6, just to get the bishop out and castle quickly, because they know that the Blackmar-Diemer is coming. It could be quite dangerous to play very slow, non-developing moves. Here you can play the move bishop to g5, immediately pinning the knight. Bishop to e7, breaking the pin. You could put your bishop onto d3, castles and castles. White has nearly completed his development, meanwhile black is still lagging behind. As I say, this is a gambit system, so you do go down a pawn, but you do get some nice fast development as a result. Now from a really aggressive gambit system, we're going to go back to another very solid opening. This one is called the Colle system. Now I myself used to play the Colle system quite a lot when I first got into competitive chess, and it's given me quite a lot of success. So the Colle system normally starts with the moves d4, and then you follow up with your knight coming to f3. You then play the moves e3, bishop to d3. You then create this triangle of pawns which guards the centre, so this pawn here is really, really powerful. You then put your knight from b to d2, and you follow it up with castles. Quite an easy, straightforward setup. Now once you've achieved this particular setup, play could continue with you putting your rook onto e1, followed by queen to e2. The reason we're playing these moves is to support the e4 pawn, and once we push open with the e4 pawn, often there might be quite a few exchanges. If we can get this pawn exchanged off in the centre, this brings our knight into play, but more importantly, this will now liberate our bishop that was trapped on c1 into the game. Okay, so let's see this opening system in action. So after a move like d4, d5, knight to f3, knight to f6, we can continue with e3, and maybe black might copy with e6, bishop to d3. At this point, maybe black, it will be bored of the symmetry. He might play a move like c5, maybe trying to play c4, but we don't need to worry here, as now we can play the move c3. And if black plays c4 here, although this looks like it's cramping white's bishop, it's absolutely fine. We tuck our bishop back to c2. It's still controlling the strong long diagonal. So instead of this, black will normally not do this. They'll play a move like knight to c6. We then castle, bishop to d6, maybe help control the centre. Now we have knights from b to d2. We have castles. And here, white has a number of different options that they can play. Sometimes they capture this pawn first to avoid any isolated pawns, or they play rook to e1, getting ready to push forward in the centre. Black might play something like b6 here, in which case we then strike forward in the centre, and after a couple of exchanges, white has managed to liberate his bishop out. It can come out to maybe one of these squares, but also he's still got good control of the centre. So this is, as I say, a very nice opening system to get you into a good position, and there are often some very dangerous attacks that black needs to be very careful of. And now we're going to look at the brother of this particular opening system, the Colle-Zukertort system. Slightly different move order here. We still play d4, followed by knight to f3, e3 and bishop to d3. But instead of playing the move c3, instead we play b3, because we're going to get ready to put our bishop onto b2, where it's going to attack along this diagonal. After this, we might do something like castles, bishop to b2, and follow up with knight b to d2. It's a very nice system. White will often have these two very powerful bishops attacking along this diagonal, and it can lead to some devastating kingside attacks. So just to show this system in action, maybe something like d4, d5, knight to f3, knight to f6, e3, e6, bishop to d2, d3, and here if they play c5, instead of playing c3, we're going to play b3. We're not worried about this pawn coming forward because we've got enough defenders against this. So black will play something like knight to c6. Here we'll castle, bishop to maybe d3 or e7, and we put our bishop onto b2. Again, this bishop is controlling this long diagonal. We'll be very happy with the exchange of these pawns here. So if we can get d takes onto c5 in the next move, this can be very nice for our position, as it's then going to be attacking along this long diagonal. And it's a very difficult system to fight against as black. So we're now going to have a look at another opening system that I used to play quite a lot in my early tournament days. That is the English opening Bottvinnik system. So the Bottvinnik system starts with the move c4 going into the English opening. We then would follow it up with something like knight to c3, pawn to g3, bishop to g2, and then we will play the move e4 entering into our Bottvinnik setup. After this, we will play moves such as knight g to e2, follow it up with castles, and then a move like g3, getting ready to put our bishop onto e3, followed by queen to e2. Now, what I really like about this particular opening system is, number one, we've got a totally locked down centre. Black is not going to be able to fight us back in the centre because we've got total control on this light square on d5. Now, but what I also like about our particular opening setup is we have 3 different plans that we can play here as white. So the first plan that we can go for is a very standard English opening plan. We can play the moves a3 followed by rook to b1, followed by b4, and going for this queenside expansion. We can also play moves like f4 and go for this fast kingside attack with f4 to f5, using our strong queen and bishop battery to attack against black's kingside. But we also have a plan of just taking over the centre if black doesn't do anything productive in the centre via a move such as d3 to d4, supporting our expansion in the centre. Okay, so let's see this opening system in action. So after moves such as pawn to c4, black could decide to opt for a King's Indian defence style position that he might play against 1d4. So he might play knight to f6, knight comes to c3, pawn to g6, pawn to g3, bishop to g7, bishop to g2. Black might decide to then castle, and here we can play the move e4, taking over our centre and getting into our Bottvinnik system. Against this, black might decide to play a move such as d6. We can follow it up with knight g to e2 and maybe pawn to c5. Black might want to try and take control of this dark square, which is a little weakness in this particular opening setup. Against this, white can play the move d3. Now he's got this strong centre of pawns, and well, against this, maybe black might put his knight to c6. We follow up with castling, and here black can play a number of different things, but he might want to try and take some space on the king's side. Against this, a nice thing to do in this particular opening setup is play the move h3. This has the idea of when we put our bishop onto e3, it's not going to get harassed by this early knight attack on g4. So this is a nice little way of avoiding that problem. Then from here, as I say, we're going to put our bishop onto e3, follow up with queen to e2, and then we're going to try and maybe go for the f4 plan in this position, as black has shut down our king side, but also he's got good control of the centre. So here we go for one of the plans out of the 3, depending on what black does. Now, the next system I'm going to be looking at is the extremely popular London system. Now, there is a ton of theory and videos on this particular opening setup, so I won't spend too much time looking at it, but I will show you some of the key opening ideas and the key setups in the London system. So the opening system for the London normally starts with d4, and normally now players like to play bishop to f4 first, but you can also play the London system via knight to f3. This is, I guess, a little slightly flexible way of playing with white, because you still have options to not go into London depending on what black plays. But normally now London system players like to play bishop to f4, follow up with knight to f3. They create this triangle of pawns like so. They then put their bishop onto d3, a very active square for this bishop, where it controls this nice long diagonal. It's protected by all of these pawns. Sometimes you also see this bishop come to e2 if, let's say, black is adopting some sort of King's Indian defense structure, where it's going to help with this pawn break on h5 potentially in the future. But normally you see your bishop coming to d3 and then knight b to d2. And then normally white will maybe put his queen onto e2, helping the central expansion, and he can decide whether or not he castles on the short side or he castles on the long side, depending on what black does in this position. Now, the London system has a lot of similarities with the Colle system that we looked at earlier, but one of the big advantages of this system compared to the Colle is the positioning of this bishop. With this bishop on f4, it's not hemmed in on the c1 square that you saw in the Colle system earlier, so we don't have to worry about liberating this bishop later on. It's already developed on move 2. So let's see the London system in action. So maybe something like d4, d5, bishop coming to f4, a move like knight to f6. We play e3 here, or we could play knight to f3. There's lots of different move orders for the London system that you can adopt. e6, we play c3, and maybe black just decides to try and again attack in the centre with c5. We put our bishop onto d3. We're not worried about this because we just tuck our bishop back. Knight to c6, knight to f3, and here maybe black might decide to put his bishop onto e7 here. They can also come to d6, which is also interesting because in these lines we can tuck our bishop back to g3, where if there is an exchange, we're happy to open up our h file to attack the king side. But sometimes they also play their bishop to e7. Here we put our knight b to d2. There'll be castles, and again we can play queen to e2. We've got the option of either castling on the short side or castling on the long side. It's up to us now on the white side. Okay, we're now going to look at another opening setup. This one is called the Stonewall Attack, and this can arise in a number of different ways, but we normally start it with the move d4, followed up by pawn to e3, and then we put our bishop onto d3, followed by knight b to d2. The reason why we've got this quite weird looking setup, it's all to do with the fact that we want to control this e4 square, and we don't want black to maybe jump a knight into that square where it can be a bit of a problem in trying to set up our system. After this we can play pawn to c3. This gives a bit of breathing room for our bishop, and then we play pawn to f4 followed by knight to f3, where we've got a very good stranglehold on the e5 square. There we follow it up with castles like so. Now there are lots of different ways for white to continue from this particular setup, but one of the key plans that white can go for is something like our knight coming to e5. We then follow up with this rook lift onto f3 followed by rook to h3, and then we might decide to do some sort of kingside attack with g4 followed by g5. In some variations as well, this queen could also come out to h5 at some point, or go e1 followed by queen to h4, where it could join in the attack somewhere. I've also seen lines where this queen comes to f3 as well, where it could maybe influence along this long diagonal. Okay, so let's see this opening setup in action. So after a move like d4, d5, e3, maybe black likes to play his knight onto f6. We've got to stop this by playing bishop to d3 to stop the knight from potentially coming into this square. A move like e6 and knight b to d2, black can no longer get his knight into the square because he'd just be losing material. And now maybe bishop to d6. We play a move like c3. Black decides to castle, and now f4. We're going to be ready to get our knight into f3 and maybe at some point in the future move it onto e5. Maybe black decides to play a move like c5. Again, we're not worried about this because we tuck our bishop back. knight to f3, knight to c6, we then castle, and well, we've got the plan of maybe putting our knight onto this square where it's firmly defended by these two pawns. We put our rook onto f3 and maybe scoot it over to h3 where it will attack on the king side from this castled king here. Okay, so we're now going to be focusing on the Torre attack or the Trompowsky attack. They often have the same name because they transpose into each other. Now our setup is going to be as followed. We're going to play the moves d4, maybe play a move like knight to f3, and we're going to follow it up with bishop to g5, or sometimes you might see bishop to g5 first if they've played this early knight to f6, which is known as the Trompowsky attack. So bishop to g5, we're then going to be following it up with moves like e3, c3, and putting our bishop onto d3. Very similar to what we've seen already with the London system, with the Colle system, this opening formation. We're then going to put our knight from b to d2, and here we then have a option of either castling on the short side, or we play our queen to e2 and maybe castle on the long side. Again, we're reacting to what black does and then decide which side we wish to castle. So let's see this system in action. So you might see moves like d4, maybe knight to f6, and here I'm going to play bishop to g5 first, and maybe black will decide to ignore it. He might play e6, he's not worried about this pin, knight to f3, and now we have, let's say, d5 here. So black goes for a similar setup that we've seen already. We play e3, bishop to e7, where it's now defending this knight and breaking the pin. We might have c3, something like c5 again, bishop to d3. Again, we're not worried about this because we tuck the bishop back. Knight to c6, let's say, and here we put our knight from b to d2, and black might want to castle at this point. We've got flexibility here, as I say, for white. We could either put our queen onto e2 to maybe support the centre. We could also put our knight onto e5 in some lines, and we can maybe do some plans such as h4, h5 and h6 to try and attack white's king side. So a very simple plan for white here. So our final opening system in this video is going to be the Vienna game. So this starts after the move 1e4, the only opening in this video which has 1e4 as the starting move. We're going to be following up with this very solid knight to c3, immediately defending this pawn on e4. We're then going to play moves like g2 to g3, bishop to g2. We're going to put our knight from g to e2. We're going to play d3, now helping support the centre, and finally castles. And from here, white will normally play a move such as h2 to h3. This is to stop any annoying knight attacks on here, or bishop coming here at some point in the future, which might hinder our plans later on. And then we normally get our king from g1 to h2. This helps defend the h3 square from any potential bishop and queen batteries that might happen in the future. Our plan is quite simple in this particular system. We might want to put our bishop onto d3, follow up by queen to d2, and then we're going to go for a kingside attack via f4 and f5 to then attack the black king. Now this particular opening setup is really effective against moves such as 1e5. So after the moves e4, pawn to e5, we then might consider knight to c3, going into our Vienna game. Black might decide to put his knight onto f3. We follow up with pawn to g3, knight comes to f6, bishop to g2, and maybe black might decide to develop his bishop onto c5. We do need to be a little bit careful in our opening setup that we don't fall into early traps such as this, but we're absolutely fine here, as after our knight comes to e2, we don't need to worry about this knight jumping here, as we just castle and everything is safe here because we've got the rook defending, so we're absolutely fine here. So instead of this, black might just decide to castle instead, and after this we can play a move such as d3, getting ready to start going for this expansion. Black might decide to play d6 here, trying to get his bishop onto this strong diagonal, but we can stop that plan by putting our pawn onto h3. Black might then decide to put his bishop onto e6, followed up with this queen battery, but again we can stop this plan via our king coming to h2. Another reason why we put this king onto h2 as well that I forgot to mention is we can now play the move f4 because our pawn is no longer pinned to the king. So as I say, this is a very straightforward setup. We're going to be looking to play f4 followed by f5 to then start a king side attack. Thank you for watching this video looking at 10 opening systems for white. If you enjoyed this video, do make sure you leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't for more instructive content like this, and let me know in the comments below what your favourite opening system is, or if you found any of these opening systems useful to use. As always, thank you for watching and I'll see you soon. Take care, bye.